Hi everyone, thanks for joining the Northwest Institute Risk Management group's call today. And we're talking about a year on risk management and COVID-19. So with me, we have three speakers. We have Rory Barrow and Callum Bright, who are both from PwC, and they're going to go first. And if you have any questions, I'll ask them at the end of the presentation. It'll be around 20-25 minutes. Then I'll hand over to Mark Roberts, who works for Sellafield Site Limited, who will then do another presentation. Mark's background is business continuity. So with that, I'll pass over to Rory and Callum to take us through their perspective.
Thanks very much. So firstly, apologies for the not full screen presentation. We're having a couple of technical issues, so hopefully it will be big enough for everyone to read. But first off, we just wanted to introduce ourselves quickly. So I'm Rory Barrow. I'm a senior manager in our governance, risk and compliance team based in the Manchester office. I originally joined PwC, 13 years ago nearly, in our external audit practice, became a qualified accountant and then moved into focusing much more on all things governance, risk and control. My main focus currently is around enterprise risk management, but also on supporting organisations going through a UK listing on the stock exchange, ensuring that they have sufficient procedures in place to be able to report timely and accurate information to the market and meet the requirements of the UK Corporate Governance Code around things like risk management. So based on that, I'll hand over to Callum.
Thanks, Rory. Hi, everyone. My name's Callum Bright. I'm a senior manager and I'm based in Bristol in PwC. I sit on the leadership team for our enterprise risk management practice across the UK. Very similar to Rory, I actually started in external audit and became a chartered accountant and very quickly saw the light and got out of that. So I've been spending the last few years working with organisations, mostly kind of across the FTSE 100, but also a lot of large private organisations as well as central government as well in terms of improving their approach to risk management.
We could maybe move on to the next slide. That would be great.
Fab. Thank you. So I guess March 2020 feels like quite a long time ago now. I think it's probably one of those moments where you think about where you were when you heard the news. I remember I just got back from crossing the bridge back from Wales. I've been at a client in Cardiff and heard the news we were getting into lockdown. And it seems pretty vivid and pretty dark. But it was a long time ago. I think, you know, we wanted to reflect on what did it feel like at that time being a consultant in this space. I think, you know, initially straight after that lockdown announcement, I think it was really around uncertainty. So actually we weren't that certain the impact that lockdown would have on a lot of our clients. I think, you know, we sit more in the advisory space and historically when it comes to organizations, you know, cutting costs quickly or cutting activities quickly, things like external advisory work is often one of the first to go. So we didn't really know what that would mean for us. I think what was quite interesting is of the projects that were already in train for us, very few of them got cancelled. I think what we did see is a stop for a few weeks while organisations sorted themselves out and steadied their ships. But I think you'll know from the worlds that you live in that actually most organisations very quickly got back to doing what they do as an organisation, and we really didn't see that much tail off of work, just kind of push back on timelines. I think, you know, when it comes to risk management, and we'll come on to it a bit, but the pandemic really highlighted a lot of weaknesses in people's approach to ERM. So actually, most people, if anything, wanted more support with their approach to ERM rather than less. I think, you know, from an ERM perspective, it's been really, really positive and beneficial in terms of the pandemic opening up that broader conversation around risk management. I think often it can feel a bit theoretical and we were very quickly having a lot of conversations with clients, whether it was specifically about ERM or more about their risk management more generally. And I think, you know, in those first few weeks of lockdown, a lot of it was ad hoc advice on how they were doing risk management and concentrating of activities around that. So it was definitely a few weeks of really interesting conversations actually with clients in terms of they were really living it, and actually testing their ERM frameworks out, which to an extent they hadn't done before. So getting real-time feedback on that was really interesting. I think in terms of delivery for us, one of the areas I was particularly concerned about is delivering of risk workshops. You know, when you think about things like risk assessment exercises and risk appetite conversations with execs and boards, actually you're speaking about some really difficult issues, and I think often being in the room and that trust element, it has always seemed quite key to those meetings, and I was particularly concerned that people weren't going to necessarily be as open and honest when they were sat in their pajamas in their bedroom. What we actually found is I don't think there was any dip in quality in terms of risk conversations. Actually, people were just as open, just as engaged. It was just working out how we ran those and facilitated those meetings a bit differently. I think chairing those meetings took on a bit of a new meaning when you've got lots of people with the virtual hands up, etc. But actually, I think we've got very good very quickly at chairing effective virtual workshops. For me, the real issue we're facing now with that is hybrid workshops. So I was running one a few weeks ago where we had most of the people in the room, but a few people on video, and I found that a lot more difficult than virtual workshops. So again, I think that might be the new norm for some organisations for a while. So working out how we can practically facilitate in the most effective way possible is something we're really focused on.
Thanks, Callum. It's really interesting actually to think back about what happened last March. And I remember sitting in my flat in Manchester thinking, this is only going to be a few weeks, you know, we'll get it under control and then everything will kind of go back to normal. It's quite interesting to think back 15 months on in a completely different house with a cat in tow that was what I was thinking back then and how everything has changed. And actually, from a work perspective, I saw a lot of the work that I was doing around the IPO space basically come to a halt as people, as Callum said, steadied the ship. But that has remained on hold for a much longer period, and we're only now starting to see kind of an uptick in that kind of deals space again. But that's really encouraging, right? Because the expectation is that we're going to have a deals-led type of economic recovery from this, where a lot of organisations go through transactions, listings, and all that kind of good stuff, which is a really exciting time. So if we think now more around how the situation evolved through the pandemic, if we could move on to the next slide. You know, as Callum said, as the dust started to settle and organisations got used to the new normal, and realised that performance hadn't necessarily been adversely impacted as much as people expected, discretionary spend returned very quickly. And, you know, we were as busy as ever, but dealing with having to do virtual workshops and all that kind of fun stuff. I think it was very rare that I would have my video on a conference call pre-March 2020, and now it's just natural. And everyone started doing it, which is great because it's enabled us to engage, being able to see people rather than over the phone, but it felt very unusual at first. And, you know, as Callum said, the pandemic highlighted a lot of weaknesses in how organisations approach ERM and the accuracy of risk management procedures. A lot of the more sophisticated organisations that we work with from an ERM perspective actually had a pandemic reference somewhere in their risk registers, but in the majority of cases, this was seen to be such a remote likelihood that very little was done to actually prepare for what that might look like for an organisation. So whilst it was there, had it actually been managed effectively? And as the situation evolved, we've seen a lot of organisations begin to focus on what needs to happen to enable effective change to avoid being caught unprepared, as so many organisations were in March. And since the pandemic, and more specifically restrictions in the UK began, we've seen a number of organisations start to rethink what ERM is and think about their approach to ERM much more broadly than they were previously. It's no longer seen as a kind of box ticking, this is good governance exercise. The value of it has really been highlighted. And as the situation evolved as well, we're seeing ERM be the start of what has now become a much broader conversation, as I just said. It's highlighted the critical link between risk management and effective business continuity management. So ERM now seems to be an openness and much wider conversations with an organisation from a consultancy perspective. We may have a first conversation around helping an organisation put a risk framework in place, but then it expands into other areas of business operations. Callum, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to reflect on with that as well.
Not really, Rory. I think all your points were bang on. For me, it's the pandemic, you know, did present an opportunity to have a really good conversation around risk, and you know, I think often when we're giving examples to organisations around real risk events and what went wrong, they are in specific industries or specific sectors or with specific organisations, and that sometimes presents challenges in terms of, but how does that relate to us? I think the pandemic provided a risk event for all organisations, regardless of how big or small they were or what sector they sat in, and it does provide a real life example that as risk professionals we can very easily link to the organisations that we sit in. So I think I found the quality of conversations around risk where people actually have recently were able to kind of identify tangible risk reward decisions they were having to make day to day in the real high of the pandemic, meant it was a lot easier to put some of the what we might talk about in terms of ERM theory into practice. So so that's probably the thing that's really evolved over the last few months for me.
Yeah, great. So based on that, let's start thinking about looking ahead and think about whether the principles actually of what risk management is have fundamentally changed as a result of the pandemic. So if we could move on to the next slide, we've got kind of 6 key things to think about. But at a high level, the core principles of risk management haven't changed. These are just 6 key things to think about and consider. So the first is thinking about the unthinkable. So as I alluded to previously, a pandemic was on a lot of company risk registers, but it was not taken seriously potentially, or it wasn't effectively mitigated because it was considered so unlikely to impact an organisation to the scale that it did. And whilst the scale of and impact of COVID-19 may not have been foreseeable, we have seen pandemics, epidemics happen in recent past. So we could potentially have seen certain scenarios that would have impacted organisations and maybe thought around what was the realistic worst case scenario to ensure that we were prepared for what was to come. And effective risk management is all about reflecting on what the realistic worst case scenario is when you're identifying and assessing risk. Were these considered previously, or was it actually just the worst that we could imagine? And you know, that is beginning to think about expanding how you accommodate a wider horizon and ensuring the right minds are focused on identifying potential high impact risks. And one thing the pandemic has definitely highlighted is whether there is a need to focus more on high impact, low likelihood risks. And we're seeing much more focus on from organisations on the inherent risk level where likelihood might actually be more significant, to really think about how they respond to those in the event that they do occur. Secondly is make sure that all of the risk response options are considered, and that's really about thinking about the risk versus reward. So effective risk management is all about thinking about how you can effectively mitigate a risk, but it's not, you can't mitigate everything. So it's thinking about what do you get the most benefit from mitigating. you're not going to spend a huge amount of resources and money and time on mitigating a risk slightly. You want the impact of that mitigation to be really meaningful. Otherwise, it may be better to refocus your efforts elsewhere. And then the final point that I wanted to talk about was around promoting a positive risk culture. And as Callum was just talking about, we've noticed that risk is now an easier discussion to have with a wider group of people as well. The pandemic has really highlighted what risk management means and how risks can be really quantified. So building on that and working with it and promoting that culture across an organization to promote and empower employees to think about risk, think about how risk may evolve in their area of the organization, and bring that conversation forward is going to be a really effective way of developing the conversation as it moves ahead and as we evolve out of the pandemic.
Yeah, and for me, the risk culture thing is really key, and we saw that in the pandemic. So I think, it's one thing to have a culture around risk management when you're all sat in an office together and you can kind of look over shoulders and have discussions about risk. I think what a lot of organizations that we have talked to found is actually when people were sat at home with children not at school, and trying to cope with the effects of lockdown, their individual approach to risk decision making massively changed, for various reasons. And for me, actually getting that culture around risk ingrained in individuals is a really key bit, because then it doesn't matter where they're working physically, they should just have a risk first mindset. And the organizations where risk was very much drilled into people actually meant that they were addressing risk management out, sat at their home on their laptop, the same as in the office. I think where it really differed is where risk management is a process, is a siloed activity. Actually, people were then thinking about risk in a lot more individual way during lockdown, and that comes with all sorts of problems. I think moving on to number 4, for me, that is a way of pushing risk culture, is embedding the consideration of risk formally within decision-making forums. So often there's especially an exec level, there might be a conversation about risk, and then there's the conversation about everything else. What we're really trying to advocate is how can you make sure that risk is an explicit consideration within every major decision that you make, and thinking about things like investment forums and how is risk consistently applied in that context is a really good way to actually get people formally thinking about risk outside of the risk register. I think 5 for me is a real big one, and a shift that we've seen is actually how do we get the right risk information in the right time to make risk-informed decisions. So typically for a lot of organizations, and I'm talking about big FTSE organizations as well as those on smaller organizations who may be viewed as less mature in terms of risk management, actually a lot of the risk information came around that regular reporting cycle, whether it be quarterly or monthly, around risk. I think what organizations are starting to realize now is they need to have more proactive and dynamic risk data available, and that's a real focus for a lot of our clients going forward. So actually, how do you, at the touch of your fingers, have the right risk information you need in a timely fashion to make risk-informed decisions? Because actually, if you're relying on a quarterly reporting process, the information you might have available might be a couple of months out of date, and that's not going to help drive the right decisions being made. And I think that the pandemic really highlighted around risk appetite as well. What are the types and amounts of risk as an organization that we want to take? Often there's a lot of time to sit and debate those around big decisions, but actually when it came to the nub of the pandemic, organizations were having to make decisions very quickly, and those who hadn't articulated risk appetite in a practical and formal way found it very hard to know what was the correct risk decision they should be making, but also whether they were actually inside or outside their appetite anyway. And looking back, a lot of organisations we talked to kind of have looked back and realised they were outside of their risk appetite, but they didn't even really know it because they didn't really articulate what their risk appetite was properly. So a lot of organisations now are trying to focus on articulating their risk appetite in a more practical way, using metrics, key risk indicators, etc. So that those throughout the organisation can understand it and use it to inform their decision making, but also so they can monitor it more easily, because actually there is no point having a pretty risk appetite statement that you spend a few hours on as a board once a year and you put it away in a drawer. It should be, risk appetite is useful when it is driving decisions. So a lot of organisations are grappling with how they do that within the context of themselves. Should we move on to the next slide, please? So we really just wanted to finish off by thinking about what do we see for the future, and I guess that kind of overlaps with the last slide. But for me, as we've talked about, I think one of the few upsides of the pandemic is it provides us as risk management professionals a really good example that we can go and talk to people about in a way that they understand. And I think within your own organisations, being able to identify some examples of where big risk decisions were made during the pandemic and how they were made, whether it be really positively through your ERM framework or actually where the ERM framework let you down, and people weren't making risk decisions in the right way. It provides a lot less theory and a lot more practice to get people who maybe don't see risk management as part of their day-to-day responsibilities to have a good conversation around. So I think that's really positive, and I don't think that's going to stop. I think there is going to be a lot of uncertainty nationally, globally, and there's a market level for a long time going forward. So it provides a really good platform to have some really interesting and difficult conversations around risk. As Rory alluded to earlier as well, I think there is more appreciation now of second line functions roles in the management of risk. So actually being able to monitor and test the first line's management of risks is a really key function, and being that those functions that do the why and the how and ask those difficult questions is really key. And I think it's an example where, as Rory talked about, just because people had a pandemic risk in place, were the controls that they had identified against that risk sufficient, and could they actually be actioned? That's really the role of the second line, and I think that the pandemic's really brought that to the fore in terms of the role that the second line, including the ERM team, can have in challenging the business's management of risks. It is really key.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important point. And I think the only two things that I wanted to pick up on before we kind of come to a close and open this up to any questions is, I think, Callum referenced earlier that at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a real concern about how effective virtual risk assessments would be. And actually that concern was quite quickly reduced, but now we're coming out of the pandemic and we expect restrictions to end and the work at home order to kind of be lifted, hopefully within the next few weeks. We still think that there will be a focus on, if not remote working, then hybrid working. So, how will risk assessments be effectively performed where you have some people in a room and some people on video calls? Will they be able to contribute effectively, and how, as kind of consultants or individuals that are going to be leading risk assessment workshops, do we ensure that everyone, either virtually or physically in the room, has their opportunity to be able to contribute? And within PwC, for example, we're thinking very carefully around our big team meetings and how we run those, where we have a hybrid of people in the office and people working from home. And suggesting that everyone still attends virtually, even if they're in the office. Is that a workable solution going forward? I think that's yet to be seen, but it will be interesting to see how that evolves. And then finally, I've said this before, but the pandemic for us really has broadened the conversation around enterprise risk management. It's no longer especially from kind of the less mature organizations, the start of the conversation may be, can you help us implement an effective risk management framework? But then it very easily and quickly expands because of the appreciation of what true and effective risk management can achieve in an organization and the value it can add in ensuring that you are capable and able to respond to the most kind of impactful events. So that's kind of all we wanted to say. So the last thing to say is kind of thank you for listening, and it's been a real pleasure coming to talk to you and ask if anyone has any questions.
Thanks very much, Rory, Callum, that was excellent. Yeah, any questions? There's nothing in the chat. Any questions at the moment? Anyone wants to unmute and ask them a question, then please go ahead. No questions so far. I'll ask you a quick question. Are you finding you're busier now or less busy? How's your kind of portfolio of work varied?
I think so. Initially, from my perspective, at the very least, a lot of my work did get kind of put on hold, and it came back in kind of over different time periods. Some projects that I was working on at the time the pandemic hit have literally come back, and I'm only just restarting work on now. Others kind of paused for a couple of weeks. The organisation kind of went, okay, we've dealt with the immediate impact of COVID-19. We now really need to start thinking more broadly and get back on with everything that we wanted to do. Now I think I am busier than I've ever been. And part of that is because I think some things take longer in a virtual world and it's harder to keep things moving. But the other element of it is there's a real drive behind risk management across industries now, and more people are thinking about risk management than ever before, I think. So really great for Callum and I.
Yeah, I would say we're probably busier than ever. I think the kind of nature of some of our work's changed though. So we're probably doing less what we'd call like a review and recommend engagement, and where we go in and test a framework and point out gaps. I think the pandemic did that for a lot of organizations, and so actually a lot of it is more about, and it's more exciting for us, is actually working with teams, ERM teams who now know what their weaknesses are and working out how they solve those problems to get better risk management. So, and I think that does take more time as well, because a lot of the time they're not simple solutions. So yeah, we're all super busy at the moment, which is great.
Awesome. Thanks very much, guys. Really appreciate your support and for talking to us. I think, Rory, you're going to drop now, aren't you? But I think, Callum, you're staying on for any questions at the end. So
I can actually stay as well now. So we'll both be here if there are any questions at the end.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. With that, I'll just hand over to Lynn briefly, just to so Lynn Stalker's on the committee for the North West IRM as well, and she's going to just introduce Mark.
Hello. I'm just going to introduce Mark Roberts. So Mark's the Head of Business Continuity and Recovery Strategy at Sellafield Limited. He's done a lot of work both inside and outside the company or during the pandemic. And for the services to the community of Cumbria during COVID-19, Mark was recognised in the Queen's birthday honours. He received the Medalist of the Order of British Empire. So that's for all the work that he's done both inside and outside the company from a continuity and resilience point of view. So I'll just hand over now to Mark for Mark to do his presentation.
Thank you, Lynn. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see me okay. Thanks for that very, very kind introduction, Lynn, and thanks for welcoming me to the IRM. So if we've gone to the next slide, please. So it's just an overview of some of the points I'm going to be covering. There's an awful lot that I could have picked up on and details gone into, but I've tried to surface the thoughts that I thought would be something to reflect on, and possibly from a risk perspective as well. So I'll not assume that you know about Sellafield site, so we'll start off with a quick familiarisation slide, and then we'll get into it. So next slide, please, Lynn. Okay, so Sellafield site, it's been around for a long time. We've got about 80 years of development of the site, and what that presents us with here and now is basically a massive environmental remediation challenge that we have to carry out safely, and obviously we need to keep the site secure. So safety and security are really dominant themes, and obviously we're very highly regulated. In terms of business continuity, obviously for a site of this scale, I mean, we cover 2 square miles, and you know, having a workforce of approximately 10,000 on the site alone during day hours, we can't just walk away when a disruption takes place. We need to maintain the facilities across the site. As you can see, there's an awful lot of them. We have to maintain those facilities in a safe and secure state around the clock. We need to continue to be legally compliant, which means we need to keep various activities going, like our environmental labs. We need to maintain the utilities that support the site infrastructure, our ICT control systems, etc. So the staffing on the site, even though a lot of people that were on the site could transition to working from home, there were a lot of people that still needed to attend that site every day, applying COVID safe working using our enterprise risk assessment measures. So that's the sort of background from a continuity perspective. The continuity, absolutely key. So next slide, please, Lynn. So one of the first things for me that I wanted to share with you was about the early days of the pandemic. A lot of people talk about March, and for me it was January. So you know, talk about a year on. It is nearly 18 months on from my point of view. We first saw this taking shape in China, in the Wuhan province, around mid-January, and certainly that's when we triggered our existing pandemic plan for the company. We were closely monitoring reliable information sources, World Health Organization, the UK government sites, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Public Health England, etc. And it was extremely fast moving. I don't know how it was for the people on this call, but certainly from a personal perspective, 1 minute we were looking at the news over in China and the lockdown, and we're thinking, never happened here. You know, it'll be contained within China. It'll go away. And people were a personal reflection. It wasn't until actually that message around the 23rd of March, the stay-at-home message. Up until that point, a lot of people were simply carrying on their jobs and their working lives pretty much as they had. So things were changing extremely quickly, and I'd say from a company point of view, I think were it not for the fact that I was closely monitoring the situation and triggering our pandemic plan on a precautionary basis and starting to take actions on the basis of that, if we'd left it to late March, I think we would have been in a very different situation. So that early horizon scanning and invoking the plan and having discussions with the team that make up the pandemic plan response team, we wouldn't have been able to get ahead of the curve in terms of altering our cleaning regimes on the site, looking at our hygiene in, for example, high traffic areas like change rooms and canteens where there aren't always readily available wash hand basins. So we introduced sort of hand gel distribution throughout all of our offices. We had the time to establish clear COVID-19 communications with our workforce, so we had a dedicated place on our corporate web page and an inbox where the workforce could sort of communicate their queries and issues and whatever. And we were also looking ahead to our ICT network capacity as to how do we get more of our workforce online? Can the network handle it? Have we got enough capacity and tokens for remote secure access? And obviously by the end of March, we were already closely engaging with our executive crisis management team on the issues that we were facing. So that horizon scanning, really key, and it enabled us to have a warm start. So next slide, please. So what I want to communicate with this slide is a lot of people talk about pandemic plans. The really important thing is that actual capability. Capability doesn't come with a plan. That's only a small aspect of it. Capability is about people, and it's committed people that got us through this pandemic and continue to. It's that commitment. So I guess what I'm saying here is, yes, having a pandemic plan is a great thing. It was good that we did have one. Government were very interested in it early on, so it was good to be able to provide that. But the capability of having a team to enact the plan and the thinking that are committed and hardworking, that's the really important thing that gets you through disruptions and crises. So by late February, our crisis management support team was standing up. That's about roughly 24 people who provide close support to our crisis management team that are made up of the core members of the executive. My reflections on that time, it was great that we had those people to support the effort and to work with me closely very early on. It was a massive help for me. Could it have been earlier? Do you know what? I wish it was. Those first couple of months were an extremely testing time to be a head of BC in Sellafield Limited. It felt quite lonely at times, so I was very glad when the crisis management team was stood up. in terms of things starting to bed down, once the crisis management team and the support team swung into action, we quickly decided on a number of cells that we needed to take the key decisions within the business and build a battle rhythm, a daily battle rhythm. So we formed cells around operations, supply chain, projects, people management, etc. And I think it's fair to say that structure that we developed worked pretty well. We maybe wouldn't have or need exactly the same structure in the future, but this time around it was good. In terms of keeping people fresh in the crisis management support team, it was a good call early on to develop a rota. We were working 7 days a week, so we had a 7-day rota where people could have some downtime and weren't working a solid 7 days, as quite a few of us had been early on, which obviously isn't sustainable. So main message in terms of the horsepower is regard the experience and skills of individuals as a risk in itself, because the thing that got us through this was committed people, and that'll be the thing that will get us through disruptions in the future. So next slide, please. So the other message that I think is powerful, I call it make friends before you need them. Getting through the pandemic for a large organisation like Sellafield Limited brings into play the importance of working in partnership with your stakeholders. We're a government organisation, obviously, so we need to be take decisions very much in step with government, and we have a large network of suppliers, regulators, etc. So having those relationships in place beforehand really paid dividends, and one of the key relationships for me was the one that we've forged over a long number of years with the Cumbria Local Resilience Forum. Being a trusted member of that LRF community meant that the comms flow right from the outset were really strong. If I needed to pick up the phone over a weekend and look for some advice, whatever that may be, I could call somebody, you know, on a Saturday afternoon. I didn't have to explain who I was, what I do. We could just get straight into the conversation, and you know, we could discuss, you know, anything that we needed to, really at the click of a finger. So that was really powerful. Through the LRF, the strategic coordination group chaired by the police and the tactical coordination group, they were running on pretty much a daily basis, especially early on. And for us as a company, being able to dial into those SCG and TCG teleconferences, where we're getting the sort of hot updates from government on the emergent local situation, that was really key for us as a company to inform our situational awareness and the decisions that we're taking. And it also enables us to listen into those discussions and consider whether we can play a role in supporting the county and the community. So the message there is, think about your stakeholders or potential stakeholders in a disruption. don't wait for the disruption to happen before you start to recognise the importance of getting to know them. So make friends before you need them. It will make it easier if a disruption arises. So next slide, please. So just following on that theme of the standing of the business within our community, obviously we can't have somewhere as enduring as Sellafield's site with around 80 years of history and the massive workforce that we have without having deep roots in our community. The site and the workforce I would consider to be inseparable from the community. The community isn't a different thing. The organisation is part of it, and we need to be very careful to recognise that. We did from the outset. So recognising that, one of the cells that we established that I led was the community support cell, and through establishing that cell, it enabled us to mobilise our corporate resources in the most effective manner, and to target that within our community. We didn't do that in a random way, and I think it's fair to say that had we not enacted some of the approaches and structures that I'll share with you on the next slide, things could have been pretty chaotic, because you can imagine that we're a go-to organisation for the community when they need support, and things could have been pretty chaotic in terms of how we would triage our resources. If we weren't careful, we could have been giving valuable resources to areas of lesser need, and then come the time of getting a requirement from a critical frontline organisation like the NHS, we could have fallen short. So the way that we mobilised that resource was through our partnership with the LRF, to make sure that when an ask came in, that could be the triaging of those assets could be done through the LRF. So those few pictures on the slide, I'll just talk around some of these briefly. On the left-hand side, you can see the sort of mapping illustration. GIS mapping is a capability that was in high demand from the local resilience forum, whether it be mapping cases, deaths, or whatever it may be. Within Sellafield, we do have GIS mapping expertise, and our mapping team works in really close partnership with the local resilience forum throughout the pandemic to help them with their situational awareness, feeding into the multi-agency information cell. Obviously, being the site that we are, we have a lot of PPE on the site, and it wasn't as simple a case as let's identify all the PPE we have and just give it away, because obviously we need to make sure that as a site that we were retaining the PPE that we needed to ensure continued safe operations around the site. So that needed some careful thought before we started to we had to basically segregate what is it that we can release in support to the community without it having a detrimental effect on the safety of the site itself. Where we couldn't provide PPE, so for example there was a big requirement for gowns from the NHS. We didn't have gowns, but we did have suppliers that could procure them. So the company contributed £200,000 to the procurement of gowns through one of our existing supply chain partners. So that's an example of one of the things we did. We have personnel who are used to managing helplines, so we provided staff to a call centre in Carlisle. We worked with the Health Protection Board as part of the Local Resilience Forum when we were establishing our test and trace facility, and that facility wasn't just for the SL workforce. We actually extended the use of that facility to the families of our workforce as well. Had people with COVID risk assessment skills that supported risk assessments in the county, and obviously we had a massive number of volunteers within our workforce, and we worked in partnership with the Local Resilience Forum to be able to communicate with our workforce where their efforts could best be targeted in community hubs and the approaches, so that they could do that safely and could do that in a way that didn't have a detrimental impact on the site in terms of their availability. So next slide, please. So this is a bit of a busy slide, but I'll explain it at a high level just to give you a view on how this works. The orange boxes, not sure if you can read them all, it doesn't matter too much, but the orange boxes represent the external structures that we were dealing with. So on the top left, you've got COBRA and governments feeding into Strategic Coordination Group, Tactical Coordination Group, Health Protection Board, and then at the bottom left, those boxes are the tactical subgroups within the Local Resilience Forum that all dial into the Tactical Coordination Group. So we've got things there like education, logistics, PPE, business continuity. So what we did was we lined up people from within SL that had the appropriate experience and were trusted. That experience wasn't just from the day job roles. So for example, within my team, one of my team members is an ex-deputy head teacher, ideally placed to tap into the education cell and be a member of that. So by tapping into these various cells, we weren't joining those cells as decision makers. It was more as listeners, to be somebody trusted in the group that could bring back situational awareness into our organisation, into Sellafield Limited, as to what's going on, and to consider how we might be able to support those various subgroups. So we did that within the community support cell through the daily meetings that we held. So we'd go through our representatives on those groups, understand the needs, and then try to marry up those asks and fulfill them. So that's the bit on the right hand side. So through our internal cells and through the business, we could marry up. This is what the LRF and the community need in terms of support, and this is how we can marry up that need in such a way that we can provide it without negatively impacting our own business, and then through the LRF triaging it to feed it into the community. So next slide, please. I think it's important to recognise the pandemic wasn't all negative. It was actually a catalyst for a lot of positive change, connected working, more people being able to do their work from home in an agile way, more people with laptops, etc. That taking away our reliance on physical offices, which improves our resilience. We've got more people talking about organisational resilience and business continuity as part of our core business as well. So that's got to be a plus. So next slide, please. So this is the last slide. Few closing thoughts, a little bit thought-provoking perhaps. First one I'll start with is the number of times I heard, we never thought this would happen. For me, a fundamental aspect of resilience and business continuity in an organisation is people have to fundamentally believe that bad things can and do happen. If people don't believe that, it's very difficult to get people to invest time and effort in preparedness and business continuity, because it will never be their top priority. So the follow-on thought from that is, well, if you didn't think it would happen, we've already touched upon sort of risk registers. You know, how closely do we look at our external risk environment? I know a lot of organisations are very inwardly focused with their risk register, and that's very understandable. But each county has its own regional risk register. We've got the national risk register, and the World Economic Forum provide the basically the international global risk register. All of these things are freely available. What I'm not saying is look at all those reports and pile all of the risks into your own risk register. Not at all. What I am saying is be cognizant of those risk registers. Look at what is in them and where those risks may bring a vulnerability for your own organisation. Consider whether you want to enter that risk on your risk register, such as a pandemic risk, for example, and make it visible and communicate that risk and relate it to your preparedness and readiness should that risk happen. What I always say is, what would you do if it happened tomorrow? Horizon scanning risk in BC, it's clear from the previous presentation as well, those capabilities should work in a collaborative way. My challenge is, do they work as closely as they should, and could those links be even closer? Think about people and capability, not just plans. If you're, especially if you're a large organisation or part of critical national infrastructure, find out about your local resilience forum. Risk and business continuity are part of their core business. So in the spirit of make friends before you need them, find out about your LRF. They're pretty welcoming places. It's not all over yet. A lot of people might think it is in terms of the pandemic and risk. We're still in quite a volatile place with new variants. Unavailability of people is still a thing. If you have to self-isolate and that stops you going into a physical place of work, if that's your role, for us, that's still on the watch list. Keep reviewing your pandemic risk. It's worthwhile. And I think my final point is about knowledge retention. Try and capture the knowledge whilst it's still fresh in your mind. Update your plan. Build your resilience and keep it fresh. Don't let things die away. Seize the opportunity. And that's the close. Unless there are any questions. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Mark. That was great. We're out of time, actually. It's now past. But if you do have any questions for Mark or for Callum or Rory, I do see one on the chat. Then if you could please let us know. I'll speak to the IRM about how we can communicate with you and answer those questions. But thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Callum, and thanks, Rory. Really appreciate the great presentations, and hope you all have a great day. Thanks again.